Incest, abuse and money, a story similar to a Greek tragedy. This is the case of Barbara Baekeland. Born Barbara Daly in 1921 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to father Frank and mother Nina, Barbara had a troubled childhood. Both of her parents struggled with their mental health. Nina, Barbara's mother, was released from an institution just before Barbara was born. When Barbara was just 11 years old, her father lost all his money in the Great Depression. He took his own life through carbon monoxide poisoning. He made it look like an accident so his wife and daughter could collect the insurance money. He was fixing something in the garage and left his car running. Barbara's brother also tragically died in a car accident shortly after that. Once the insurance money had been collected, Nina relocated herself and her daughter to New York City. They actually got a suite at the famous Hotel Del Monaco, which is now known as Trump Park Avenue. As a young adult, Barbara was incredibly beautiful. She had porcelain white skin, flaming red hair, and she managed to get a few modelling jobs, including Vogue. She wanted wealth and fame, and she used her beauty to become a fairly prominent socialite, attending many high society parties and mixing with famous people. Young, attractive and climbing the social ladder, it would seem that Barbara kind of has it all. But she is not mentally well. At the time, she has daily visits to a well-known therapist who states that he is frightened of Barbara's psychosis. He never reveals what exactly she has, but when she gets married, he openly says, God forbid they ever have a child. She dates various wealthy men, and when she tries to get into the film industry, she ends up being introduced to Brooks Baekeland. Brooks is a trainee pilot for the Royal Canadian Air Force. He is very rich, good looking, everything Barbara would want. Brooks is the grandson of a famous inventor who first invented photographic paper and then subsequently went on to invent plastic. He sells his business for $16 million, which is a lot of money now and was an astronomical amount back in the 1920s. I think to convert it, it would be roughly $300 million today. So Brooks is insanely wealthy, and his profession is to be a writer, although he never really puts pen to paper. He can just live off this money and just do whatever he wants. By this point, Barbara and her mother Nina are living well beyond their means. They're still renting this suite in New York, and although Barbara has a few modelling jobs, it's not enough to keep up on their expenses. Brooks found Barbara to be staggeringly attractive. He loved her passion for poetry and words, and after a whirlwind romance, Barbara tells him that she has fallen pregnant, so he quickly whips her off, basically for a shotgun wedding. They cross the border into California and quickly get married. Barbara, however, is not pregnant. She just said she was in order to get Brooke to marry her. Brooks wasn't a naive man. He knew that his now wife put up a facade. He openly said that he hadn't married his soulmate, but a powerful antagonist. They move into a luxury apartment in New York City and host wild parties with famous guests from Hollywood actors, playwrights, novelists. But all is not well. Barbara's mental health is unstable. She has rude, unprovoked outbursts of rage. She goes into severe depression at times and often turns to alcohol. Both Barbara and Brooks end up having many extramarital affairs. This is not a happy marriage, it is a very toxic relationship. 2 years after marrying, they do have a son, Anthony. Anthony and his mother are very close from a young age, but all is not well in the mind of this young child, which we will later explore. Barbara and Brooks continue to host these lavish parties, and they are quite infamous. They have some weird after dinner games where the men would line up behind a curtain, expose their genitals, whilst the women would have to pick whose genitals belong to which man. In 1954, when Anthony is 8 years old, Barbara and Brooks decide to uproot their life from New York and just kind of travel around Europe in this kind of nomadic existence. They go from Italy, Paris, London, hosting these extravagant parties, like taking this wild ride all across Europe, having extramarital affairs, everywhere. They basically took their train wreck and their toxic relationship international and dragged their son along with them. Brooks, however, is getting tired of it and he wants to divorce Barbara, but every time he mentions it, Barbara threatens to take her own life. She doesn't want divorce, she doesn't want to lose any money, and she doesn't want to give up this lavish lifestyle. In the 1960s, they are mainly based in Paris, and this is where at one party Brooks meets a French girl. She is 15 years his junior, and she is the daughter of a diplomat. He falls deeply in love and wants to leave Barbara. He tells Barbara, "That's it, I've fallen in love, I want to leave you." But Barbara does attempt to take her own life, so Brooke calls it off. He cuts ties with the French girl and carries on with his marriage to Barbara. By 1967, Anthony is now based in Spain whilst his parents are over in Switzerland. He meets this tall, dark, handsome man called Jake Cooper. Jake, known as Black Jake, not because he was black, but because he liked to delve in the darker side of life. Think sex, drugs and rock and roll. He introduces Anthony to hallucinogenics, mainly mushrooms. Jake is bisexual and him and Anthony begin a romantic relationship. Anthony at this point identifies himself as homosexual. Barbara hears through a friend about this relationship her son is having with a man and is horrified. She gets in the car and races to him in this kind of, in her mind, she is rescuing her son. She gets him, and when they're trying to cross some of the borders, Anthony has actually forgotten his passport, so they end up in jail for a night, but eventually make it home. She is horrified to find out that her son is gay. So she starts trying to introduce him to other girls, and Anthony does begin to date a young, lovely girl called Sylvie. And Barbara is so happy about this that she wants to introduce Sylvie into the family really quickly in the hopes that Anthony will marry her. So she attends dinner parties with them, holidays, and Barbara's saying like, look how much money we have, look at the lifestyle you could lead if you marry my son. And Sylvie is buying it. She is buying it. She likes the idea of this lifestyle, but not with Anthony, with Brooks. And her and Brooks end up having an affair for quite some time before it all comes out. When Barbara finally finds out, Brooks says, "That's it, I want to leave you, I'm in love with Sylvie." Barbara attempts to take her own life again, but by this point, Brooks has just really had enough. 22 years of a toxic marriage, he files for divorce anyway. The divorce never actually completes, and you'll find out why later, but Brooks does end up marrying Sylvie and he has a son with her. Now Brooks not only abandons Barbara, he abandons Anthony as well. He wants nothing to do with him. Anthony and Barbara relocate to London where it's just them in this flat. Both of these individuals are not mentally well and probably should not be living together. Barbara ends up dating a curator, Sam Greens. Because Sam is a curator, Barbara is keen to show off her son's artwork. Anthony has been doing art since he was a child, but this is unusual artwork. It is bloody, very violent scenes with humans sort of attacking each other. He has done this from a very young age and it's often disturbing for many people. Sam Greens likewise was not impressed by it. And I think these graphic images that Anthony has been drawing since a child are an insight into his mind. He is not well, and I'll cover that slightly later. So Barbara is having this affair with Sam Greens and eventually it kind of dwindles out. For Sam anyway. Barbara is obsessed. She stalks him relentlessly, and when he moved to the US, she followed him briefly and walked barefoot over Central Park in just a fur coat and demanded to be let into his apartment. Over time though, her obsession with Green dwindles, and this is where we begin to see a more complex relationship developing with her son. Anthony is a disturbed character, and before his parents are divorced, both Brooks and Barbara think he is a genius. They can't see him as disturbed or ill. They think he is creative. He's like a prodigy in a way. One friend recalls that Brooks once was proudly telling her how his son Anthony rips the wings off of flies to see how they would survive. The friend was so disturbed by that, not just that that's what Anthony was doing, but that his father was proudly telling that story. Anthony liked to torture animals, like he would torture crabs, flies, any kind of insect. It was well known, but his parents didn't see an issue with that. As a young adult, Anthony was actually diagnosed with schizophrenia, but Brooks believed that the field of psychiatry was immoral, so he refused any treatment to be given to his son. It seems as though the parents are in denial. They perhaps think they're above everyone else, and they just don't think that anything applies to them. And this kind of attitude is taken at the extreme detriment to their son, who desperately needs medical help. When Brooks runs off with Sylvie though, his opinion on his first son changes. Previously he thought of Anthony as a genius, you know, he doesn't need any intervention, he's fine how he is. But when he runs off with Sylvie, he then says that he finds his first son strange and peculiar and wants absolutely nothing to do with him. So when Barbara and Anthony moved back to the UK in their Chelsea flat in London, this is when things really go downhill. So although Brooks and Barbara had their own mental health issues, it seems as though Brooks stopped it from tipping over the edge. And without him there, with Barbara and Anthony being alone, it went downhill very quickly. Barbara takes it upon herself and she decides that she's going to cure her son of homosexuality. In order to do this, she hires sex workers. When the sex workers didn't work, shall we say, Barbara then intervened herself to try and get the result that she wanted. So this gets very disturbing and an incestuous, abusive relationship begins with Barbara raping her own son. Barbara, however, thinks she is providing some innovative therapy for her son and she is going to cure him of homosexuality. She even tells friends what she's doing. She's not ashamed at all. This situation is so distressing and so horrifying, but it also gives us a glimpse into how unwell Barbara is as well. So Anthony, he has schizophrenia. He is also taking hallucinogenics thanks to his friend Jake, and he has an abusive, incestuous relationship with his mother, who is trying to cure him of his homosexuality. He then tries to murder her. As Barbara is leaving their Chelsea home, Anthony jumps out and grabs her hair, trying to drag her and throw her into oncoming traffic. This is what he wants to do, but Barbara clings onto the gate. Anthony starts smashing the gate onto her fingers in order for them to release. She is holding on tightly. He breaks her thumb in 3 places. He's pulling at her hair and just slamming this gate backwards and forwards against her hand. Eventually he decides that this isn't going to work, so he runs inside to get a knife. At that moment, Barbara's friend Sue Guinness returns home, sees Barbara just lying dazed and confused on the pavement and kind of scoops her up and screams for help. Anthony realises what is happening and flees. Police arrest Anthony for attempted murder, but Barbara refuses to press charges, so it's basically dropped. Although this is a cry for help from Anthony really, and he is sent to the Priory, which is a famous private psychiatric rehabilitation hospital here in the UK. He didn't stay long though and was released fairly quickly as an outpatient. He received frequent sessions by a doctor, and this doctor was very concerned. He warned Barbara that her son was out to murder her. He is violent, he is mentally unstable, and she should be wary of him. Barbara just dismisses these concerns. She doesn't think her son is a threat at all, even though Anthony is continually violent towards her. He stabs her in the eye with a pen one evening. He has violent outbursts towards her at random moments. So even though this is happening and the doctor is warning her, Barbara just refuses to believe it. 2 weeks after the doctor's warning, in 1972, Barbara is in the kitchen making dinner. Tony wants to have a friend over, but Barbara refuses. She just doesn't want to see anyone, and this turns into an argument which quickly becomes violent. Anthony sees red and murders his mother in a brutal attack. He punches her and he stabs her with a kitchen knife. Barbara dies almost instantly from that one blow at the age of 51. Anthony at the time is 26. Barbara hadn't finished making dinner and Anthony is still hungry, so he decides, whilst his mother lay dead on the floor, bleeding, to order Chinese food. And when the police arrive, they find Anthony just calmly on the phone ordering takeaway. Anthony is arrested and charged. Whilst in custody, he is repeatedly asking how his mother is. He is found guilty of manslaughter and is sent to Broadmoor Hospital to undergo treatment. Brooks, his father, thinks that this sentence is far too lenient. He believes his son should have been found guilty of first-degree murder. He thinks that the psychiatrists are wasting their time and that his son is just pure evil. Tony is actually only at Broadmoor for 8 years. He is released aged 33 on, I think it was some kind of bureaucratic error or like an agreement between the UK and the US, because he was moved back to the USA where he lived with his grandmother Nina, who was Barbara's mother. She is now 87 years old. I don't think anyone truly realised the danger of sending Tony to live with such a frail elderly woman who perhaps couldn't help him with his mental health, his emotional outbursts, and the fact that he needed regular medication, regular visits, things like that. But he is sent to the USA and he moves in an apartment with Nina daily. He lived with Nina for just 6 days, and during that time, in the sweltering heat, he just stayed in that apartment. He created this kind of macabre shrine to his dead mother. He would mumble satanic verses and play like morbid music. After 6 days, Tony and Nina got into an argument. Tony wanted to make a phone call to the UK and Nina refused. Tony saw red and ended up stabbing this poor 87-year-old woman 8 times. Not only did he stab her repeatedly, he was beating her black and blue. Suddenly, within this kind of frenzied attack, the doorbell rings. It's Nina's nurse who comes to visit her every morning. Anthony answers the door and screams at this nurse saying, "Help, I've just stabbed my grandmother." The nurse runs to the nearest payphone and calls for police. Police arrive to discover Tony complaining to the officers that she just won't die. The knife won't go in and she keeps screaming, "I can't understand it." Nina was still alive and screaming for her life. In his confession, Tony admitted that he wanted to have sex with his 87-year-old grandmother, and when he initially injured her, he believed it would be kinder just to kill her. She survives though, so she doesn't die, she survives, she's absolutely fine, despite the fact that all of those stab wounds hit the bone. So Anthony is charged with attempted murder and is sent to Rikers. Anthony's time at Rikers was interesting. He kind of came into his own. He inherited his trust fund, and that meant he could use his money in many ways. He would pay people to protect him. He would also gift people for sexual relationships, including a male guard and an inmate who had been imprisoned for raping and decapitating a young boy. After 8 months, Anthony expected to be released, and there was some kind of delay in admin because the USA wanted his medical records from the UK in order to get a better picture of what this person was truly like. Anyway, after this initial hearing where it got delayed, Anthony is returned to his cell, and later that day he is found dead on the floor. He had suffocated and he had a plastic bag around his head. Many people believe, and many sources say, that Anthony took his own life, but it's not conclusive, and his own father believed he was murdered. He thought that maybe Anthony was going to spill the beans on the male guard having a sexual relationship with him. Although a few people perhaps think he was murdered, most believe that he took his own life. Some actually felt relief when they heard that he had died, including Sam Green, the curator who Barbara had an affair with. Aged just 33, having had an incredibly troubled and abusive childhood and young adulthood, Anthony was never given the support and treatment he needed, resulting in a tragic end to a young life. In an ironic twist of fate, he died using the same material that his great-grandfather invented, creating his family fortune. My name's Emma. This has been the case of Barbara Baekeland. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe and comment, and I'll see you in the next one.